Following the 2016 U.S. presidential election, cyber and information security topics have dominated U.S. national headlines on a daily basis. Each morning, Americans across the country wake up to articles examining the role influence operations in cybersecurity played in shaping the 2016 election. Though these topics might be new for American audiences, they are not for Russia and the Russian people. Good morning. My name is Austin Bowman, and I will be moderating our second panel this morning on cyber and information security threats to domestic orders. Each panelist this morning will have 5 minutes to present their remarks, after which we will open it up to the audience for questions. Audience members, please submit your questions to Pigeonhole. So let's hear it. How does the fear of external influence and interference affect a society's perception of outside threats? How unique and different are cyber and information security threats? And how should governments respond to these new types of threats? The first panelist to speak, Professor Elena Zhdanov, is a senior lecturer at the Department of World Politics at MGIMO University, and she is the Deputy Director for the Center of International Information Security, Science and Technology Policy. Unfortunately, she was unable to be here today, but she has sent a video message that she wants to show.
Hello, my name is Elena Zhdanov. I'm Deputy Director of the Center for International Information Security and Science and Technology Policy at MGIMO University. I'm speaking on behalf of the Director of the Center, Ambassador Andrei Vladimirovich Krutskih. The topic of my presentation is the possibilities of international cooperation between Russia and the United States of America in the field of international information security. Challenges and threats in the information area are the key challenges for the contemporary international security. International cooperation in this area is especially important, especially cooperation between Russia and United States of America, who are both the leading states in the area. Russia advocates for the international peace, prevention of arms race, demilitarization, and non-interference in internal affairs in information area. It must be sustained by fair and equitable treatment of all states, regardless of the level of their technological development. The system of international information security should guarantee equal security for all. Despite some contradictions in Russia-US relations, we have one important agreement which regulates our relations in the area, namely the joint statement by the President of the United States of America and the President of Russian Federation on a new field of cooperation in confidence building, signed in 2013 during the G8 summit in Scotland, Loch Earn. Based on this agreement, the following measures were taken in bilateral relations. A communication channel and information sharing arrangements between computer emergency response teams were established. The use of the direct communications link between nuclear risk reduction centers for this purpose was authorized. A direct communication link between high-level officials was established in order to manage potentially dangerous situations arising from events that may carry security threats by the use of ICT. Based on this document, a bilateral working group was established. However, in the year 2014, the activity of the working group ceased its operation, but the line of direct communication continues to function. Under these circumstances, it is important to use any opportunity for dialogue. Several bilateral consultations were held, including the ones on military line. It is important to agree not to militarize the information sphere and establish the rules of the game, rather than wait for serious crises in the area, as was the case with nuclear and biological weapons. This can be achieved by adopting the rules of responsible conduct of states in information space at the United Nations level. Most of the rules have been already agreed upon by the United Nations Group of Governmental Experts on International Information Security. All states are interested in protecting information sphere and ensuring the democratic work of the Internet and global ICT. Both Moscow and Washington are interested in avoiding interference in internal affairs, in supporting disarmament in cyber weapons. It should be useful to conclude a bilateral agreement on the prevention of incidents in cyberspace, similar to the agreements already concluded to prevent incidents in the sea and airspace. Thank you for your attention.
And now we will turn to our second panelist. Joseph Nye is a university distinguished professor and former dean of the Harvard Kennedy School. He has served as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, Chair of the National Intelligence Council, and Deputy Undersecretary of State for Security Assistance, Science, and Technology. Joseph Nye, you have the floor.
Thank you. I want to start by congratulating Fletcher and MGIMO for having this conference. We certainly have a situation where both the United States and Russia are worse off for the nature of our current relationship. So good for Fletcher and MGIMO. I'm going to say a few words about the 2016 election, which is, there are many causes of our current discontents, but the 2016 election is a good part of it. Ironically, this is one area where I agreed with Donald Trump. I felt that the Obama administration had not done a good job with the Russian relationship. And then Russia was, in a sense, too clever by half, because they made Donald Trump unable to accomplish at home what he otherwise would have tried to accomplish in U.S.-Russia relations. But history's full of ironies. Let me step back, though, from the current situation and ask about this new dimension of information and cyber. What's new and what's not? External influence is not new. Soft power has been around for a long time. It was part of the Cold War. And Putin said in 2012, soft power implies a matrix of tools and methods to reach foreign policy goals without the use of arms, but exerting information and other levels of influence. I received a very interesting paper by one of your MGIMO colleagues and others, Victoria Ivanchenko, in which she distinguishes between active and passive soft power, or you might think of it as intended and unintended soft power. And in that sense, there is in the way we think about this, we're trying to focus more on the intended than the unintended. Not the city on the hill effect of external influence, but the direct efforts to influence internal affairs. Now, information warfare is also not new. The U.S. and Russia have used information warfare for a long time. Going back to the Cold War, the U.S. not only had RFE and so forth with broadcasts, but we interfered in elections in Italy and France and elsewhere. So that's not totally new. So when the Russian Chief of General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, said in 2016 that when we deal with foreign threats, using conventional troops is often impossible. These information threats can be counteracted only with the same hybrid methods. That's true, but it's not new. And in that sense, I think we ask, what is new? And I think cyber has added the following dimensions that are new. Cyber allows intrusions for information warfare to be faster, cheaper, and more easily deniable. And that also is related to a new vulnerability of our societies in which the internet has become a substrate for political, military, and economic affairs, which makes us both more vulnerable. And that led initially to a great deal of concern in American thinking about what Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta called a cyber Pearl Harbor, where the grid would be taken down or something of that sort. And in that context, there was a good deal of U.S. and Russian cooperation. We established the hotline, as already mentioned, since 2004. The U.S. and Russia both participated in the UN Group of Government Experts, the GGE, and in 2015, that group, with Russian and American signatures, came to an agreement not to interfere with each other's critical infrastructures, which was then taken to the Group of 20 most important countries in the world economy and was endorsed by the Group of 20. So there has been a case of real progress. The question, though, is it didn't solve something that the United States added later as what it called its 17th critical infrastructure, was our election system. And in 2016, it was clear, and the U.S. intelligence agencies have made this clear, and I tend to believe them on this, that the Russians deliberately intervened into the electoral process, which means that the problem that we faced here was not the one we'd been focusing on, Pearl Harbor and bringing down the grid, is what I wrote about in an article in International Security in February called Dissuasion and Deterrence in Cyberspace. It's events that occur below the level of armed conflict, or sub-LOAC, law of armed conflict type of disputes. And the question of how do you handle and deter those? In 2016, Obama used the hotline to tell Putin, knock this off. In September, when he and Putin met at the G20, he said, cut it out, it's having bad effects on our relations. It obviously didn't stop the GRU one bit. And essentially, what you found was a series of Russian denials, which has brought the issue to the fore, which is not just the intelligence communities, but when Facebook was testifying before the Congress recently, they showed that after Mark Zuckerberg at first said it was exaggerated or preposterous, Facebook disclosed that Russian false information on social media had reached 126 million Americans in the 2016 election. That's a pretty good number. Now the question is, what do you do about a situation like this? What the Russians did in 2016 was go beyond the traditional broadcasting and insertion of false news propaganda to hacking into the private email systems, which is another level of intrusion, and then doing what's called doxing, or disclosing documents for embarrassment and interference purposes. And if you pick up your New York Times today and look at page A8, you'll see that British researchers have said and shown that Russia did the same thing with the Brexit vote in 2016. So this has become something which the Gerasimov doctrine, if I quoted it correctly earlier, has become quite operational, and not just in the U.S. relationship. Now, what is to be done in conclusion? I doubt that the United States and Russia are going to be ever able to agree on norms about an internet freedom agenda or the type of thing that Hillary Clinton talked about in 2011, 2012. I think that's outside the realm of feasibility. There are too many differences in values on how we define free speech and limits on free speech to make that feasible. The question is, could we imagine getting agreement on rules of the road? And there, if you go back to the Cold War and the example of nuclear weapons, it wasn't that we in the Soviets agreed on a full set of values to be able to reach agreements on the Limited Test Ban Treaty or the Non-Proliferation Treaty or the various SALT agreements, but we found it prudent to be able to agree on rules of the road to limit our conflict. I wonder if we can't be looking for possible rules of the road on how we're going to handle these issues of hybrid warfare, as Gerasimov called it, or information warfare, to use a more traditional term, or the new dimensions that are introduced by cyber technology. I would think this ought to be a very high priority for the next session that meets in Moscow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Nye. Our next panelist, Igor Stillman, is a senior lecturer in the Department of Applied International Political Analysis at MGIMO University, where he teaches intelligence analysis and analytical methods. He also serves as the executive director of International Trends, one of the most prominent Russian academic journals, focusing on international relations. Professor Stillman?
Thank you so much. So first thing, it is great to be here. It's great to be at Fletcher back. I had this experience a couple of years ago. Second thing is a kind of disclaimer. As we have this kind of debate of irresponsible academics, I'll try to be provocative in what I'm saying. And third thing, third disclaimer, I won't go into these allegations too much regarding Russian alleged intervention in the US political system. I'm not an intelligence analyst myself, so I don't have specific knowledge. I know that there are claims on the US side that they have facts, and there are claims on the Russian side that there were not enough facts to criticize Russia on whatsoever. So I think as a kind of uninformed public, I would focus on some other issues. And I tend to also to agree with Professor Nye when he was saying that there is nothing. The cybersphere is just another sphere of interaction between states, and it's just the next instrument. And we could expect discussion on cyber, actually, not on only this panel, but on many other panels. The next panel will be on jihadism and terrorism, and there is a cyber terrorism, right? If we talk about military security, we could also talk about military operations and cyber operations as part of the military conflicts, right? So the one thing I think where cyber is different, as the new field of interaction between states, the rules of engagement in this area are not clearly defined, and that creates a problem of sometimes of moral hazard in relations between states. Therefore, there is I'm not sure that these rules of engagement will be created through some treatments or some treaties or some negotiations in particular, but I think through the practice of interaction, the states will be able to create more clear understanding what are the real red lines. But if we talk about our specific topic that we have for our panel, I think that there is now a tendency to look too much at the instruments, at the instrumental component associated with the specific technologies, but the substantive element, which is the center of our panel in my perspective, is the challenge of interference and non-interference in the domestic affairs of other states. And ironically, if we look at the academic literature, there is much well-documented criticism on the theoretical level to what extent political subversion could be an effective policy to make other states to act accordingly to the interests of the foreign nation. So if we talk also about the recent examples, Washington had very demonstrative examples in previous decade in countries like Iraq and Afghanistan. The political figures there who, bluntly speaking, were brought to power by the United States, eventually drifted away from friendship with the US, and they made friends with Iran, for example, in Iraq, right? And they strengthened their legitimacy through America bashing on some occasions. So if we talk about academic literature, it is quite questionable to what extent interference in foreign affairs of other states could actually provide some positive results for the state who is doing that. But on the political level, we know that the politicians are extremely sensitive, and this especially in the relations between major powers. And we could remember that through the Cold War, the non-interference was a major issue in relations between Soviet Union and the United States. We remember the Kennan's argument regarding the containment of communism and the McCarthyism in the United States, as well as similar concerns regarding what was called in the Soviet Union the counter-revolution forces, right? The counter-revolution in Moscow. And after the Cold War, and until 2016, I believe there was a perception of invincibility towards any kind of interference in Washington. But this was clearly not the same in Moscow. Moscow remained deeply concerned regarding the prospect of the US interference in its domestic affairs for a long time. And I would say that especially since 2005. If we look at the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, Russia, to much extent, viewed that first, the US was actively involved in encouraging and promoting Maidan, and second, it was a kind of a drill or training exercise, and the various instruments that were used in Kiev were seen as applicable to Moscow as well. So on the conceptual level, I would say Moscow retains an ambivalent view regarding the US policy, and that's my controversial, provocative element. On the one hand, Washington is seen as a messianic power roaming around the world with its democratic promotion agenda. It is seen as kind of Bolshevik state, which is similar to early Marxist belief that it is impossible to meet democracy in one country, and there is a need for the global democratic peace, so to say. The US is expected, therefore, by Moscow to ruin the pockets of stability in the already unstable world, as it happened in Iraq and Libya, for example. And at the same time, a widespread belief in Moscow is that Washington recognizes as democratic only those states which accept an American leadership, or as in Moscow they will say, an American hegemony. Therefore, the military dictatorship in Turkey was acceptable, and Erdogan populist government is not acceptable because it is seen as not democratic. Hamas government, which came to power through the electoral process in 2006, was seen as non-democratic as well. So obviously there is a contradiction in the Russian view of US policy, which views it both idealistic and hypocritical at the same time. Moscow's concerns regarding the US democratization agenda and its application to Russia were never addressed by Washington and even recognized as legitimate. Once again, we could talk about why this didn't happen, but I just want to state that Russia has sincere concerns with that, and one illustration of interesting signaling from the United States, one of the American academics, before he joined the Obama administration, wrote a book with the title, literally, Promoting Democracy Abroad, Why We Should and How We Could. And in several years, this same academic became the ambassador to Moscow. So what kind of signal this sends to Russia and to the Russian leadership, right? The sympathy towards Donald Trump, which emerged in Moscow during the election campaign last year, could be attributed to the belief that he, unlike previous ideology, was a realist. He could increase military expenditures and be thought less than fully competent on some issues, but he won't follow this democratization campaign of the previous administrations and therefore refrain from intervention in Russian domestic affairs. To what extent these expectations materialize? On the leadership level, there is obviously less of high-profile human rights and democracy sabering. On the level of day-to-day diplomatic communications, not much has changed. As for this day, State Department under Trump issued 16 press releases related to domestic affairs in Russia and human rights. The one last, it was issued basically today, and in which 13 times it's included statements of concern, calls for some actions on the Russian government, and different kinds of criticism on the Russian government. So to what extent the US would appreciate if Russia calls to some actions in regards to the Black Lives Matter, for example, organization, or state its concerns regarding Weinstein affair or Moore's affair, that's an interesting question. Finally, on the agenda to move forward, in Russian expert community, the current situation, I think Dr. Zinovieva demonstrated it quite clearly, is sometimes represented as an opening for a kind of arms control in such cases as information security and cybersecurity. Moscow proposed such measures for years, but they were declined by the West as inconsistent with the freedom of speech and communication, or as it was seen from the Russian side, with the desire of American internet services to expand across the globe. Now, as the US perceives itself vulnerable in cyber and media spheres, in Russia there are certain expectations regarding possible, finding these arms control measures. I would claim, however, and that's my personal position, that it is not reasonable to expect that mutual vulnerability will produce negotiated outcomes anytime soon. if we could draw a parallel from the nuclear arms control, while perception of mutual vulnerability emerged maybe somewhere after 1957, Sputnik goes down in the outer space, it took 15 years until the first arms control treaty was signed in 1972. So I would say that if it turns about the future directions, we would see a time of arms race when both sides, and I think primarily the United States, will be seeking to achieve cyber information invulnerability unilaterally. Only when many millions and billions of dollars and rubles will be spent on that, and these attempts will fail, we could expect states to come to negotiations of common regulatory mechanisms. I'm sorry if my remarks were a bit hectic, but I tried to be on time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Istomin. And finally, we have Maura Karlin, who is an associate professor of practice of strategic studies at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and a non-resident senior fellow for the Center of 21st Century Security and Intelligence in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. She has served in national security roles for 5 U.S. Secretaries of Defense. Most recently, she served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development. Professor Carlin, you have the floor.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here this morning. This is a conversation that needs to happen. So like Joe, I pass on kudos to MGIMO and to Fletcher for starting it. This is a panel about threat perception. It's a panel that looks at how do we understand the Russian threat to the US domestic order, and what do we do about it? It is an issue of profound concern, and I think it's pretty safe to say that if we were all sitting here 5 years ago, this panel would not have been on the agenda. Inevitably, of course, it is also influenced by broader views on Russian national security aims. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about knowns and a little bit about unknowns, and then offer some thoughts on what the US should do. So here's what we know from a US perspective. When we look at when Russia has used force in recent years, we see examples like propping up an authoritarian, rotten dictator in Damascus, or dismantling the sovereignty of a free country like Ukraine. We spend a lot of time looking at Russia's military doctrine. We hear about something known as escalate to de-escalate. If you're not familiar with this, it effectively means that if you and I are in a fist fight, you're going to pull out a gun. I think you can tell that escalate to de-escalate is pretty euphemistic for escalate to escalate. We see a doctrine that treats society and its military as one, a doctrine that blurs the differences between war and peace. And then, of course, we get into the cyber realm, which is a pernicious one. One of the areas where you actually hear a lot of agreement amongst us is this question of whether or not cyber is a special tool. And I think on the whole, from what you've heard, we don't think it's special. We think it is yet another tool in the toolbox. To me, it is analogous to the Air Force and how it thought about air power at the beginning of the last century. Suddenly, you could go over, not through. That was tremendous. It was not going to be profoundly game-changing, however. But it's a tool, and it makes things easier. And what's interesting, Joe had talked about Secretary of Defense Panetta's comment about the cyber Pearl Harbor. And it's a perfect example. When one thought about a cyber Pearl Harbor, the idea was, what do you do about your critical infrastructure? How do you protect your critical infrastructure? And yet it turns out it wasn't the cyber Pearl Harbor we had to worry about. It was actually this idea of cyber doubt. How cyber would be used for productive disinformation. How it would be used to pollute narratives. How it would be used, most dangerously, to make the truth uncertain and to foment distrust and faith in US institutions, which are, frankly, a comparative advantage for the United States. It's important to note, however, that this tool is being used to build on a disorder that already existed, right? And we saw this past election was always going to be unique. with a candidate like Donald Trump. Given economically what was happening within the United States, given all sorts of issues with race relations and other things, there were a number of issues. There was already a sort of an element of chaos that had existed. And yet, there appears to be a lot of evidence that Russia used this tool as a way to foment and build on this disorder. So those are the knowns. The unknowns are a lot more interesting. What we don't know is what effect is Russia actually seeking? So with the US election, what was the aim? Was the aim to undermine this trust in US institutions? If so, that is arguably a whole lot more dangerous and pernicious than what ultimately resulted, which may have been another aim, which was to elect President Trump. When we look at this doctrine that I walked through, is the aim simply to deter US action in certain areas, or is it actually to employ this doctrine? Those are pretty different questions. And it all stems down to the biggest unknown, which is ultimately, what is it that Russia wants from a national security perspective? As it looks at the United States, does it want US instability? Does it want US weakness? These are different spots along a continuum, and they will have different effects. So all this said, if you're sitting in the United States, what do you actually do about all of this? And I'll offer 3 thoughts. Number 1, you have to accept that the US system is designed to constrain action. Look at the founding documents of the US government. It is designed to constrain action. That is arguably a very good thing. It is also really frustrating when we are talking about these sort of challenges. But it means that we cannot ever obsess over countering this disinformation, countering this nefarious cyber activity on a one-to-one basis. It'll never work. We'll never be as fast enough. We will never win it. So number 2, make people aware of what's happening. Arguably, what we are seeing in the cybersphere and the information operations sphere from Russia is an effort to shade the truth, to obfuscate it and confuse. We need to make people cognizant that this exists so that they put their antenna up and that they are reading and thinking smartly and rigorously. And thirdly, we need to establish resilience. We need to make sure our infrastructure is resilient, our system is resilient, and protecting ourselves. I suspect if you asked all of us, we will agree that we have not seen the end of this challenge. So as the falling man said, so far, so good. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Carlin. At this point, we will open it up to questions from the audience, and we'll take the first one that we have here. To what extent can President Trump improve relations with Russia in an environment where such policy on his part could potentially be viewed as confirmation of a Russia connection?
Well, that's what I meant in my introductory remarks, that Putin was too clever by half. He was about to get the election of American president who was inclined toward dealing with him and working with him, and he so polluted the political climate in the United States by the clumsiness and scale of the Russian intrusions that he has made it impossible for Trump to do the things that Trump wanted to do. I think, frankly, the chances of doing something serious between Putin and Trump are not likely, and it's not likely until the Mueller investigations are finished. That's a rather pessimistic view, but that's what I mean by too clever by half.
Exactly.
Well, I maybe say a couple of words about the Russian perspective on that. I think that and that's the challenge also in the relations, because from the Russian perspective, what is happening is Russia becoming the part of the US domestic politics. And the Russian perspective, it's not about us. It's about what happens in the United States, and that basically some parts of the American elites try to destroy the Trump presidency using Russia as a scapegoat. That's the perception. Whether it's right or wrong, it's more to the Americans to comment, but that's the perception in Moscow, how the situation is perceived in the United States. And on the other hand, I would say that from the Russian perspective, I think there was a thought that with Trump it will be easier and there could be some positive developments. But I think we are at the end of the disillusionment process. And I think that the major kind of a point which showed specifically that there's not going to be any significant improvement in Russian-American relations anytime soon was the adoption of this summer by the US Congress of sanctions against Russia. So in the Russian perspective also, we know by our experience that if the US adopts any sanctions, they're not going away, never. We had this good example of Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which was adopted in the 1970s because there were restrictions on the Jews going to Israel from the Soviet Union. And it basically remained in the 90s and in the 2000s when the Russian borders were quite open. And when it was repealed, it's like a few minutes after that, there was Magnitsky Act, which was introduced as a kind of compensation for the repeal of Jackson-Vanik Amendment. So if you are under American sanctions, I think the Russian perspective, you will remain under them forever. So that's seen as a major impediment to the relations as well.
Thank you very much. Moving on. We'll seek to combine a few questions here. So President Obama was critiqued in his response to Russia's interference in the election by the critique that his methods were archaic. At the same time, the New York Times claim of Brexit interference was shown to be interference of Russian speakers tweeting in English. So to what extent should the limits on free speech be a potential issue as well? Are there multiple avenues of responding to these different threats? And to what extent should the private sector play a role in this? Because we've seen with the recent move by Twitter to take RT and Sputnik off their platform that they are already limiting free speech in the private sector.
Well, my view is that when we think about cyber deterrence or deterrence about cyber incidents, that we don't think in the cyber domain only. I think that's a great mistake. That's in this article I mentioned earlier about deterrence and dissuasion in cyberspace. It's usually cross-domain deterrence, which is sanctions, among other things that you can do. And so I think the idea of just replying within the cyber domain is a mistake. Similarly, I think declaring RT a foreign agent and then the Russian response to this, I don't think this advances much. I think what Mara said is right, that awareness is crucial. Given the role of botnets and the ability to magnify a particular message in a way that you couldn't back in the days of the Cold War or other technologies, where you can get tens of thousands of amplifications of a piece of malicious news or false news. I think as somebody put it, you can't do this by fact-checking each bad story. And what you need is to find ways to prevent this amplification. It raises very interesting problems for the United States, less for Russian culture than American culture. We're extreme on the First Amendment. Very few other countries are as far out on freedom of speech as we are. But within that, we're not likely to give it up. Then the question is, you don't want the government censoring Facebook. I'm not sure I want Mark Zuckerberg censoring my news either. And one of the types of proposals that one has thought about, that's being discussed, is could you have something like movie reviews or badges or flags saying this has been identified as fake. And that allows the reader to read it, but also to read it with awareness. The argument is that it helps to inoculate. And it's argued that Macron and the French were better at this in countering Russian interference in the French election than the Americans were. One problem with this is you can use a botnet to swap this badging system. You can just have 100,000 artificial messages that are saying, this is not fake news, or this is so good. It's very hard to deal with this. You can find ways to make botnets more difficult to use, so-called CAPTCHAs, but that's clumsy. And we're really in an early stage of trying to think our own way through this in terms of our own values, much less reach an agreement with the Russians. But I'm a bit leery about, I think, identifying RT as an organ of the Russian government, which propagates a great deal of propaganda, and I've appeared on RT in interviews and so forth, and it's certainly not, in quotes, fair and balanced, but neither is Fox. And I think trying to sort of violate our own norms about free speech is a mistake in the information competition. Instead of that, what we need to do is ask, are there ways in which you can alert our public, which is basically what Mara was saying. How can you make people more alert to inoculate them? And that's hard.
So I think what we've learned in the last year is that our paradigms need to shift. So things Americans agree on, baseball, apple pie, free and fair elections. And so when we think about this notion of Russia meddling in elections, your assumption immediately goes to Eastern European elections, right? And you would expect that. But I think it was not in anyone's paradigm that that would have happened with the US election. And so needing to start to break out of that and consider what had previously been unconsiderable. That paradigm sort of breaking gets into the cyber rules of engagement, I think as Igor put really, really nicely. Trying to figure out what are the escalation ladders as we understand them in cyberspace, accepting that just as we wouldn't think about the air, maritime, or ground domains as binary, we also shouldn't with cyber. A lot of this, though, also comes down to preserving who we are. And there's a little bit of an analogy here to the September 11th attacks, a real shock to the system, arguably the last time we had a profound shock to the system like we have had with this 2016 election, where suddenly we all looked at each other and said, wait a second, what's happening? What are our paradigms? And so as we're going forward in these next few years, it's really important we remember who we are, as Joe is saying, and be careful to preserve that, because it is conceivable that there will be a slippery slope where we could take steps, say, on restricting First Amendment rights, where a few years from now we look around and say, wait a sec, we're actually not who we were anymore.
Professor Istomin, any thoughts?
Well, I think that this is a lot about the domestic American attitudes and approach to that. But if I could add to that, maybe that, of course, the US now has some homework to do and to deal with the challenges that it faces themselves. But my question would be, to what extent the US could stay within its domestic changes and domestic response, and to what extent there is a need for international, not necessarily agreement, as I said, but international talks on what is possible and what is not possible in cyberspace, information space. And that's related to my last basic argument, that I'm not expecting this to happen in any time soon. But this is the problem that we face, that we have, and this is related also to the Mara's point, what Russia really wants. When Russia looks at the United States, or China looks at the United States, it looks at the cyber capabilities that the US has, and it seems like we cannot match it. How we could match the US having all this kind of cyber and information capability, the famous framework, saying the CNN effect in information space. But if you look at the US, we were the first to establish the cyber military command, and all this information about the magnificent opportunities that the NSA has of listening to people, of working with information. So the other countries are looking at the U.S. and they're seeing that we have to catch up to the American capabilities, and this is a kind of mutual threat perception that creates this arms race approach, and that creates a search for some kind of reflection.
Could I respond to Igor?
Go ahead.
I think you're right. Some of it, what we're talking about, is purely domestic. Some of it is international. Let me give you two very quick vignettes of recent events. After the terrible shootings, the mass shootings in Las Vegas, there was a group of alt-right, as they're called, Americans, who fabricated the view that this was carried out by a pro-Trump liberal. And they got that on the internet immediately. They were primed for this, they did it. This was purely American, but they wanted to essentially advance that agenda. Question is, that was fake news, deliberately fake. Russia had nothing to do with it. But how do we, Americans, deal with that without violating the First Amendment? Yeah. That goes to my proposal a bit earlier. There was another story in the New York Times last week about a city in Texas where there was an announcement of a Muslim protest at a mosque, and then an appeal to people to protest the Muslim protest. Both of these were Russian. They were in Russian, I mean, they were traced back, they came from Russia. Whether it came from the Kremlin or not, I have no idea. But the point is, there were no Americans involved in that. The effort was by Russians to stir up anti-Muslim feeling in the United States, in the Texas city. The first of those has nothing to do with Russia, the second does. Question is, can you imagine a rules of the road in which the Americans say, we're not going to indulge in the following type of interventions in Russian politics, you don't indulge in the following type of intervention in American politics, and could we make that right? Could we verify it with attribution that's reasonable? And could we do it in the United States given our own First Amendment problems? Could we enforce our end of the bargain? And I think those are questions that need a lot more study.
If I just make
Go ahead.
to add to what Professor Nye said, I think on the one point you raised a very important question of attribution, of verification, of all this in this space, and that's why I think, for example, we are not today at the moment where we could come to some legal documents on international stage, for example, to do it. But the question is how to organize some talks on how we understand these issues, how we could start these issues. And of course, I understand that from the American point of view, to have these talks with Russia will be toxic. You know this famous example at the Hamburg meeting. There was the proposal to have a cyber talks between Russia and the United States, and it was completely backlash on the US side. But to put some constructive approach, maybe it's possible to make some efforts to talk about these issues on multilateral basis, where Russia will be just one of the participants, and then it will not create such a domestic, efforts within the United States, but it will create an opportunity to create common practices. Because from what I perceive, it's sometimes not the legal documents which create, kind of more constructive international environments, but more common practices which help to clarify the positions.
I think that's right. And one of the things that that's worth noticing is sometimes you get further with track 1.5 or track 2, which is we're trying to work through these problems, and then you present it to the government. So if you start at the top, you get caught in the politics that you described. But if you work this thing out, you may get something which can be proposed in op-eds, in congressional hearings, and so forth. So you provide protection for the top when they eventually make it government to government. And that's why I suggested at the end of my comments that this would be a good topic for Fletcher and MGIMO on your next meeting.
From a U.S. perspective, the idea of multilateral talks makes a lot of sense. What you would want to do is shoot it out as large as possible. because frankly, I think there will be a whole lot more countries that are in the US camp than the Russian camp. I'm confused as to why you would support that.
Well, I think Professor Zinovieva was talking in the very early on. We could remember, the Russia was trying to get some regulation on the internet space, for example, through the International Telecommunications Union. And some countries supported it, the Russian approach. But at that point in time, the United States said no. The United States and the UK were very clear. It's freedom of information, global information space, we cannot do it, and that's it. But if we come seriously to that, I think that many states would like to have this understanding, sometimes because they are aware of the capabilities that the major states have. And it's not only Russia, it's China, it's the United States. I mean, if you look basically at the budgets, we all are just trailing behind the US opportunities. And that's why I am not sure that the threat perception in Russia and China is much stronger to some extent on the regular basis, not related to some specific events, due just because of the US has more of that. And because also much of the internet services, if you think about it, they are of American origin. You spoke about Facebook, and that's a very good example. Even without any clear legislation on the US part, Facebook is now thinking about adapting its practices and having some things resolved so not to have this criticism within the United States. But when, in Russia, it's very controversial because we have a legislation that it was adopted, I think, last year, that internet services working in Russia has to hold their data on Russian citizens in Russia, on Russian territory. And Facebook is not compliant to this legislation. So the big debate is whether, Facebook is, because it's in clear non-compliance with the Russian legislation, is to operate in Russia. And there are a big debate that it is hard to do that because so many people use it. In the United States, you don't have legislation, but you already have the idea that maybe self-practicing, doing the job without even legislators to act.
Unfortunately, we will have to end it there, but please thank the panelists and help me thank everyone by joining us in a round of applause.